If you want to catch the second part of this conversation with Max Ajl on the Al-Aqsa flood, the meaning of Palestinian resistance, and the ongoing Zionist genocide against Palestinians, you can subscribe to our Patreon at patreon.com/redmediapr for as little as $2 a month to gain access to early episodes as well as bonus content. And you'll be supporting an Indigenous-led media project. Again, that's patreon.com/redmediapr. Thanks to all of those who subscribe, and we really hope you enjoy this interview. Today, we're joined by Max Ajl. Max, you're a friend, longtime friend. Do you want to just introduce yourself? Where are you calling from?
Absolutely. My name is Max Ajl. I am a postdoc at the Miriam Center in the University of Tunis, where I am hailing from. I'm in Tunis, where I've been for most of the last decade. And I am a historian, and I work on climate issues, and I'm a longtime activist and supporter of Palestine and all movements against imperialism and colonialism.
If I'm not mistaken, Max, I think you spent like quite a significant amount of time in Palestine. I think specifically in Gaza. Is that correct?
Yeah, I lived in Gaza for 5 months, actually, right before starting my PhD program, which gives a lot of perspective for sure. It's, of course, been very anchoring, I think, as I do my work.
So today we're going to be talking about this two-part series, or this two-part article series that you wrote for Agrarian South, Journal of Political Economy, called Palestine's Great Flood. First of all, I don't know if articles come in two parts, but it seems that this has been a quick turnaround in publishing, because you're kind of intervening as it happens. What is going on, the ongoing genocide and sort of Western collusion in this particular region. But you lay out a kind of broader sort of argument that is attempting to dispel some of the sort of commonly held notions. I think you debunk very thoroughly this broader idea of like international relations theory, or IR theory as it's known in poli-sci. But maybe you could start by kind of like highlighting some of the bigger sort of myths, so to speak, or things that obscure how we view Palestine and the United States and Israel's quote unquote special relationship.
Sure. So the whole discourse is kind of drenched in mythology at every level, and I think of the mythologies as really trying to hide from view very essential things. So I just want to quickly say what they are, and then I'm going to narrow down on your question. I mean, I think the basic relationships is you have a settler colonial movement with a fully organic relationship to the mutual benefit of the upper classes in both countries with U.S. imperialism. And against it, you have a national liberation movement within the Palestinian homeland that itself, for liberation, relies on an organic relationship with broader struggles in the region for sovereignty and possibly liberation, which of course is more expansive, right? So this is how I think is appropriate for people who believe in liberation to, or at least it's one very good approach, I should say, for people who believe in liberation to approach what's called the Palestine-Israel conflict, right? And of course, there's other traditions as well, which are not mine, but of course are in fact embraced in their ways by people who are actually carrying the burden of liberation, which is why I edited myself, actually, just to be clear. With that said, one of the fundamental mythologies that is very dominant at this moment and is gaining more traction, particularly within the kind of moderate left in the United States and the UK, like the social democratic left, who just wants to do some tinkering, a little re-engineering, a little softening, a little shaving off the rough edges of the current regime, because I think it is a regime governing that governs the U.S. landmass and too many other landmasses as well, is this idea that there is something called the Israel lobby that's diverting the US from its national interests. And, unfortunately, I think a lot of people who are otherwise sympathetic to broader struggles for liberation may fall into accepting this way of framing the issue, not least because it's very clear that there are Zionists, self-professed, in the United States who are acting in ways that are obviously nefarious to the well-being of not only people in Palestine or in Syria, Yemen, Lebanon, Egypt, Jordan, right? Not only there, Tunisia, I should say, where there, we can talk about that. But also people in racialized communities in the United States, right? It's very well known, for example, or I think it's very well known, but for example, that the so-called Anti-Defamation League, right, spied on anti-apartheid activists, right, which was like a nefarious thing to do. And it's an institution that is associated with Zionism, right, that is, you can say, part of the Israel lobby. It's fine to call it that clearly was engaging in something nefarious in the US. And so that has to be also acknowledged, though, in the analysis. So the way I see it is, and not just it has to be acknowledged, like that's part of the enemy group, clearly, right? Like I don't want anti-apartheid activists to be spied on by some private or public agency, for that matter, you know? Now, the problem is, of course, I think that this whole concept of the Israel lobby and the national interest are not from my conceptual universe. They're from alien universe, which I have nothing to do with, right? Which is international relations theory, where the state is like a black box and it has interests. It has national interests. And then there are lobbies, which maybe represent external forces to the state that are diverting it from its kind of normal or rational, but always kind of imputed or assigned because so-called interests, right? Now, I have no interest, otherwise I wouldn't be on this podcast, in the US state to begin with, right? That's very clear. But, so part of the problem with the analysis, right, is first of all, that underlying it, there is a notion that there's like a US interest that we should have any concern at all about. And of course, it's just not the case, right? On the other hand, right, I think some people at least, who are using this analysis on what I broadly say, like on our side of the aisle, right, are reacting to something very real, material, concrete, a set of institutions that are acting in a nasty way. So how can we reframe it, right? I see it as, of course, like one way of reframing it is that it's lobbies all the way down, right? That because a lobby, we can say, is a capitalist interest. And US imperialism is just a set of interests, basically capitalist, although sure, like it's always passed through a filter of a kind of ideology, right? Because that's how we understand our world. It's a set of interests that mostly disagree about some things, and then whoever takes state power, whatever capitalists they represent, they carry out a policy that is most closely aligned with whoever put them in power, that is who funded them, basically, and that is more or less, to use the very classic phrase, in the overall interests of the ruling class. That is, the state is the executive committee of the ruling class. And the lobby is part of how the state not only forms its interests and negotiates all those various pressures, but also, of course, part of making imperialism happen at all, right? Like people think, sometimes there's this idea that like imperialism is just kind of like, it's this like device. You just like, once it has its little button in motion, You press it, and then it goes like this juggernaut of evil.
Another sort of analogy would be like it depends on who's in the driver's seat, right? The car is sort of a neutral kind of thing, and then it's like, it's a neutral technology. It only depends on who's at the driver's seat. And I think what you're getting at, just to kind of be clear too, you're talking about people like John Mersheimer. I think he's like the biggest figure in this, who kind of pushes this, or who's been sort of more well known for this this idea of the Israel lobby that is sort of taken U.S. interests and spun them in a way that are not, to its core values, or distorting them or something like that.
Exactly, right. And like, again, it's like needless to say on this podcast, but like, what on earth is a U.S. core value? Right? U.S. core value is just killing people, right? Even killing its own people, like people who are like part of like the settler class, killing them too, but like especially killing people who are not part of the settler class, and especially killing colonized people, and especially killing people in the third world. Like, when has that not been a U.S. interest of the ruling class? Like, not only is that's like their main activity, right? So, that's like what to depart from, and to say, okay, then you have specific people who are pushing it here and there, but with an overall consensus about what are the shared goals and what are the red lines, right? So someone like Mearsheimer is kind of stating that, he says it explicitly, the U.S. should shift to a strategy of kind of offshore balancing, right? Where it should kind of somehow balance these other powers, maintain hegemony over them, not overcommit to kind of the Arab sphere, move to like a two-state solution, and then maybe, if necessary, kind of commit to some kind of like offshore balancing with China to make sure it doesn't get too aggressive. He also hasn't wanted the U.S. to be in a war with Russia, with Ukraine, with Russia via Ukraine, famously, right? So this is kind of Mearsheimer has been. I don't know where I came up with that, but it sounds kind of better, I think. Wersheimer has been like peddling this thing for like over 15 years, right? And we're left kind of wondering, okay, how do we refit these pieces together so that they make sense?
Yeah, and just to kind of interject a little bit, and that's kind of in the absence of a sort of what you're doing, sort of a system, like a world systems analysis of this particular situation, and looking at it within the context of modern imperialism, 21st century imperialism that has its roots, in a U.S. settler colonial project here, quote unquote, here domestically, that is exported externally. And I think, in the apps, and this is kind of a bigger, sorry to go tangential, but you're making me think a lot about like sort of the failures of the left in this particular moment. While there's been some really great momentum on the ground, the analysis, there's, in the left commentariat, or whatever you want to call it, commenting sphere in the US or in the West, kind of has this sort of diagonalism approach, where it's like, we'll use the analysis of somebody like John Mearsheimer in the absence of our own sort of anti-imperialist analysis, for the sake of like alliance or bipartisanship or whatever they're saying. And so, you're very specifically kind of like honing in at the core, like that you're like, this is an imperialist project, and this is why you need to understand this relationship. It's not just, yeah, sure, there's ideology that unites these two settler colonies, but fundamentally you're looking at, capitalist accumulation, and why this specific region is sort of a linchpin in larger sort of global geopolitics.
Absolutely, yeah. I mean, so in that sense, we should have a step back and be like, okay, what are the major U.S. interests? One, it's to prevent the consolidation of kind of fully autonomous poles of technology and accumulation, right? This is why, from the U.S. perspective, the U.S. doesn't care exactly all that much. Like, the state, the ruling class, is not, in my opinion, particularly concerned whether or not China is moving back in the direction of socialism or against it. The U.S. wants a subservient China, right? And the problem is that China is carrying out its own project with its own technological base, with a huge capacity for research and development, is taking the world lead in solar, is learning how to do the advanced level, US level microchips, aviation. Iran just also engineered a certain type of rotor that's very important for domestic refurbishment of its airplane stock and so forth. This allows for people to decide their own fate. Of course, I am a communist, but like the US issue is not just, are you a communist or not? It's like, are you independent from us or not? Now, Israel has played a dual role within this kind of worldwide ambition, right? On the one hand, overall, Israel has always been very useful at slamming projects worldwide that have sought to use the phrase from Samir Amin, in any way de-link from US capitalism. That is, build up some type of autonomy, right? To go on the road somehow to socialism or communism or liberation or independence. Anyone who said, okay, we are going to decide how to engineer our own politics and use our land the way we see fit, and use the crops to feed our people. Anyone who's even tried to do that on faces, of course, the enmity of the US. I mean, I tend to think of actually the Cold War as a war against agrarian reform, against radical agrarian reform. It's a kind of a way of reframing things. And so that I think is helpful, at least to step outside of standard frames for a second. Israel has been not only incredibly helpful in the region, right, in the Arab Iranian region, at kind of slamming any project that sought to do that. So they slammed Gamal Abdel Nasser. They slammed the Syrian Ba'ath when it was very, very radical, right? In 1967, there were like Marxist-Leninists in all kinds of positions in Syria. They performed a huge discrediting of these kind of projects that, in the whole Arab region. When Nasserism was popular across the region. Like Nasserism was also popular in Lebanon. Nasserism was popular in Jordan. It was enormously discredited. I mean, without going in, there were lots of problems with Nasserism, to be sure, but it was a project that was trying to de-link from the US capitalist orbit. And actually, it was relinking or linking up with the Soviet orbit. It was doing a lot of Eastern Bloc trade. And with the defeat of Nasserism and the downfall in 1970, trade reoriented to the North and the West, that is to Europe and the United States. So it kind of began to reweave. And when the US trades, it profits. The US is not trading for the mutual betterment, like it's like an Adam Smith textbook where like you're trading, I make apples, you make oranges, and we each get some apples and oranges or whatever, comparative advantage. No, the US is trading to its massive advantage of its capitalist enterprises. So Israel has not only done that in its own sphere, right, in slamming all these projects, destabilizing them, forcing huge portions like 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10% of GDP to go to weapons, justifying the kind of weapons investments on the part of the Gulf, which then uses them for domestic repression or uses them to kind of buy the U.S. interest in their own domestic repression and the U.S. kind of security guarantee, or to be used against Yemen to kill hundreds of thousands of people, right? It's justifying a massive kind of gyro of weapons purchases, right, on a world scale. But finally, Israel has been catastrophically engaged in counterinsurgency operation against liberation projects on a world scale, right? Starting, from the 1950s, Israel started to get involved in that. I mean, Israel was part of the tripartite aggression against Gamal Abdel Nasser, right? Especially when in 1956 with France and Egypt. This is when Nasser was perceived as a real threat, not only for his own project, but also for supporting the Algerian national liberation struggle, which really pissed off the French because, of course, they did not want to let go of Algeria. Then Israel helped the French assassinate Mehdi Ben Barka, who was one of the most organic intellectuals and organizers in the Arab region and the founder of the Tricontinental Conference, Moroccan militants, right? Israel then assassinated Hassan Kanafani, whose words were so prescient and shine so bright that we are still being illuminated by them today, right? When we read Hassan Kanafani today, we're like, this guy is lighting up our entire understanding of reality, right? And Israel eliminated him in 1972. I mean, he was this guy by himself, his thoughts, and of course, the party he was a part of, the Popular Front for the Liberation of Palestine, this was a major threat to the entire world system, and Israel murdered him. Right, throughout Africa, throughout in what was then Rhodesia and is thank God now Zimbabwe, right, in South Africa, the U.S. Israel was absolutely central to supporting the counterinsurgencies and circumventing all sorts of congressional arms embargoes. And let us not talk about its relationship with the Shah, which is one of the major oil. Iran is one of the major oil powers of the entire world. So the Shah was making sure that oil and the profits from it would be organically interlaced with U.S. imperialism. Israel was supporting the Shah. The Shah was in good relations. Sabak was in good relationships with Israel. And never mind, of course, Latin America, which was kind of ground zero for Israeli support for just absolute capitalist brutality, right? Like what they did in Central America in terms of supporting these vicious anti-indigenous fascist militia, and in what they were supporting the Nicaraguan dictator Somoza. They were supporting the Contras. What they did in the Southern Cone, in Argentina, in Chile, in Brazil, and supporting in particular the very, very, I think it's always good to remember the extremely anti-Semitic Argentinian dictatorship that systematically targeted Jewish communists, right? That was supported by Israel. That was supported by Israel when they were putting concrete blocks on people's feet and dropping them out of helicopters over the sea. That was supported by Israel. So Israel was this kind of not only carrying out this massive when you carry out this counterinsurgency, because your whole state is built on racism, and your whole state is built on putting yourself at the spear point or the hot point, the flash point of the North-South encounter, you are going to be adored by imperialism and capitalism. And this is generally understood, by progressive forces, let us say, on a world scale. Although there's propaganda against it, which we could talk about a little bit. But I think this is also very important for us to understand. Israel has really done a wonderful job from the racist perspective, from the colonial perspective, from the capitalist perspective, in serving imperialism and capitalism and destroying liberationist projects, right? And this you don't find in this whole discussion of national interest is, an undermining of why Palestine is so important to every kind of ideologically aware radical project on a world scale. Like everyone it knows to support Palestine because of what it symbolizes about how evil the U.S. is, right?
Yeah, that's a really great sort of framing, like looking at the sort of geography and the scope of this, because I think people, that's called like Uzi diplomacy, for example. And I remember like growing up as a child, I remember we got like a Nintendo, like way after the fact that it was, after it came out when we were children, and there was this game. We had two games. We had Mario 3 and Contra, which was a game that you had an Uzi and you would go around, and I had no idea it was connected, at the time, to the funding of like the Contras against the Sandinistas, right? And I think there's this kind of narrative within sort of Western liberal democracy, and you see this also on what you identified earlier as the sort of moderate kind of left in the United States. This idea that if the sort of soul of America, so to speak, is at stake in terms of like redirecting it to sort of its foreign policy to sort of more democratic, peaceful means, then also this quote unquote soul of Israel is also at stake, because there is an investment in this idea of like a quote unquote two-state solution that Israel has sort of diverted from its path at some point in time. And, we just need to get it back on track, when in fact, from the very get-go, and even before, this was a very sort of, genocidal and eliminationist settler colonial project. And it's like, you can't unbake that cake, much in the same way you can't unbake the cake of the United States. It's literally ingrained into, it operates at a structural level. And we can talk about how this is sort of challenged. And I just want to quote something from the first part of the article. And you said, the harder and stronger Palestinians fight for liberation, the more, like lightning bolts of ever increasing luminosity, they bring the relief of the world system into clearer view. The impotence of the United Nations, the imperialist contempt for international law, the complicity of the Arab neo-colonial states within Western capitalism, the fascist racism at the heart of modern European and US capitalism, as murderers and maimers operate in Western capitals, the neo-colonial structures of the Arab and Third World, and the hollowness of Western liberal democracy and its constellation of civil society institutions. And I think this is important because you're setting up, you're attempting in these two articles to, what you call, in your words, restore self-defense to its proper place at the center of social reproduction and accumulation. So maybe you can describe what you mean by that in the context of the quote that I just gave, in the sense that Palestinian resistance has illuminated the sort of contradictions within the sort of imperialist world system.
For sure. I mean, so the Palestinian struggle, as far as I see it, is almost impossible structurally to defend in Western civil society, right? It's actually illegal, right, in most of Europe. I swear, I think the Netherlands just said even from the river to the sea is incitement. First of all, what they're revealing, what this struggle, because we're all responding to a struggle that took place. And I think it's important to say that, Hamas has always called for an independent investigation of what occurred on October 7th. And so this is what I support as well, an independent investigation. If people want to talk about what occurred on October 7th, then you follow my dude, Mao, and you investigate. If you don't have an investigation, therefore you do not have a right to speak. So because I don't think like Arab guerrilla are, insane, murderous brutes, I think that the investigation would probably would certainly reveal a narrative completely sharply at odds from the narrative that the mainstream narrative and even the liberal narrative of what occurred on October 7th. What it's revealed is that this kind of nationalist force itself is revealing there's no space for it in this world. There's no space for what it's fighting for. And, I'm not a two-stater, right? I support a liberated Palestine. But what it reveals is that this world itself, because Hamas's line is for a long-term hudna, a truce. Like, I think this is their way of navigating various tensions. But in a sense, it doesn't matter. Like, Israel will never accept anything except for Palestinian surrender. This is what it's revealing. And it's revealing that the Western states are unwilling to compel Israel to accept any degree of decent life for Palestinian people. And this really, and of course, America, of course, isn't. And it's revealing is that there's material investments in the destruction, in the killing of Palestinian children, right? That this is a source of profit for the world system, right? That this is a source of profit for US capital. And it's telling people exactly what they are. It's telling people this is what Columbia University is right now. If we want a different Columbia University, of course, we give it a new name, but it can be fought over. I'm a advocate for the most part, not always, but often of fighting for what some institutions are, right? But in its current form, it cannot be anything. It cannot have any space for Palestinian liberation, right? That's not permitted at Columbia. It's not permitted in the US Congress. It's not permitted in civil society institutions. It's not permitted in the Western press. It's not permitted even to be articulated, right? In most of the European states, you can't even say it. So actually, European states are fascist. They don't allow freedom of speech, right? They do not allow freedom of speech for their own people. And that is the Palestinian armed operation which took place and the Israeli genocidal counterinsurgency in response to it has revealed what these institutions are doing and their role in the reproduction of capitalism and colonialism and imperialism. That these institutions are organically embedded in an imperialist world system. And maybe some of them can change, we should take them over and make them change. I'm like an advocate, not necessarily the US state, but of maybe university structures and so forth. That's a different story, which are actually just which are actually just banks now that have a sideline in education, right? They're actually just like investment funds that have a little side business where they give degrees. But nevertheless, I think this revealed everything. This revealed what our world looks like and what it is. And it didn't just, it's important to go beyond it's important to go beyond the US sphere. It also revealed what other forces are, right? It revealed, with our guy, Gustavo Petro, like it revealed that there is a capacity in Latin America, despite a lot of counter revolution against the radical experiments, which are, of course, still fighting for liberation in Latin America, despite like decades of counter revolution. Gustavo Petro, who's kind of a new kid on the block in terms of taking state power, can still go out there and say, I'm going to break diplomatic relations with Israel, right? That is revealing on the good side of it, of what it means to actually have a popular democratic governments in power. And it's revealing about.
Just interject really quickly, because it's important to point out why he when he first took office, one of the first things he did was reestablish diplomatic relations with Venezuela. And I think, Venezuela and Colombia, like historically, have been very close culturally. There's a lot of Colombians living in Venezuela and a lot of Venezuelans living in Colombia. But also, the reason why, people are always singling out Israel, and it's like, like Israel was funding this dirty war in Colombia. They were flooding it with weapons and munitions and intelligence, and doing all kinds of security experiments. They were using it as a laboratory, essentially, for counterinsurgency, trying to test the methods they use in Palestinians on Colombians, right? And so this isn't just like one day, Gustavo Petro had moral clarity. He's probably has friends who were killed. He probably has family members who are affected by this. And I think it's so demeaning sometimes to listen to uh, and disrespectful to listen to gringos talk about this particular issue, and to think that these are sort of irrational actors, as if they're just like he's swallowed the pill of anti-Semitism, and he's an irredeemable sort of communist, leftist, anti-Semite, and it's like you can't, like what you're describing, like even sort of we can say I can say Israel has. I can look at objectively and understand why they're doing things, but you can't look objectively. You're not allowed to. It's made illegal to look objectively, even if you don't agree with the Palestinian resistance, Gustavo Petro, Venezuela. You're not allowed. You're literally not allowed. We saw it. People are beaten on college campuses because they're not allowed to even look objectively, or even to have sort of transparency about their sort of investments, whether they're at a university or their sort of tax dollars, so to speak, or their sort of public institutions being used as weapons laboratories. So I wanted to point that out, because it's there tends to be this sort of knee-jerk reaction in the Western media. It's not just the United States. I think the United States is more guilty of it. But what happens in this moment is, like, even everyday people are not even allowed to think beyond the sort of the ideological investments in the U.S. state and its quote unquote interests in this region. And so when we see even sort of a popular, even like a counter hegemonic movement arise, both in the United States and Europe, it has to be like the only response it reveals that masks, you scratch a liberal and a fascist bleeds. That's what happens. That's what liberal democracy is essentially about. When there's a challenge to that sort of class rule and that perception, it's always going to be responded to with force, even against those who may have, maybe invoking the same sort of democratic or moral, visions that the ruling class espouses. But we're also not allowed to share interest or have an objective understanding of the reasons why, like, Colombia would break ties with Israel, not understanding its history, not understanding the position that it's been put in, not just by Israel but by the United States, is sort of this colonial outpost in Latin America that has genocided indigenous people, then genocided campesinos, and has served as an outpost for its interest in waging this dirty war against, Venezuela and any sort of neighboring country that sort of falls out of line, that delinks, as you put it earlier. Like, this isn't just a sort of economic, or cultural soft power that they're imposing. This is like a bloody history, and Israel is, I think probably like, it's when like when you think of like the apartheid South Africa movement, I think sometimes, and nothing against the BDS movement, but sometimes I think, in their idealism, college, maybe I was guilty of this too at a certain point in time, but there was a sort of idealism of nonviolent sort of protests, and I don't advocate for violence, but it's like there's this idea that somehow nonviolent protests like defeated apartheid, which is a complete distortion because Israel was arming the apartheid regimes. They were backing Rhodesia, the white supremacist countries. There was a lot of bloodshed. A lot of people died. Nelson Mandela was in prison because he refused to renounce armed resistance as a legitimate form of resistance. He was not. I mean, yeah, he was a peace activist, but he also believed in the right to self-defense. And I think we've gotten to this point where it's like you've mentioned it earlier, and we interviewed Frances Hasso before on this podcast, and she talked about this sort of celebration of the iconography of the third world woman taking up arms, fighting for national liberation. But we can't actually have that sort of celebration or even understanding, even if you don't agree with that. We can't have that sort of same objective understanding in the present. It's literally not allowed. Even if you like morally disagree with it or whatever, you can't talk about it because it's illegal. And if you talk about it, you're going to be on a no-fly list. You're going to be sanctioned. You're going to lose your job, right? So I think what you're saying is very important, but also, you're talking about self-defense as a legitimate sort of analytic and understanding this particular situation.
Self-defense is like a human universe, is like a species universal. It's like a cross-species universal. Like most organisms engage in self-defense when they're attacked. So are Palestinians aliens? Like, what's the supposition here, right? It's actually one of the most normal like trans-species reactions you can possibly find. To look for that we would look for survival strategies in the face of an attack. Um, you know, um, and you brought up a lot of important points. So that a few things one thing that came to mind is practically the last page of I think it's Piero Glajaisi's Conflicting Missions is when he talks about the specter of Black Cuban troops successfully defeating white mercenaries in Angola. And this was actually, it was just a few months later that the Soweto uprising occurred, right? That this actually broke an important psychological barrier amongst that this was like the worry of all sorts of intelligence services. They were like, oh shit, like these well-trained Black Cuban militia in one of like the major humanitarian interventions, to use the phrase in modern history, were actually catalytic in the overall anti-apartheid struggle, right? And of course, this is all erased. The whole frontline states, the whole idea that there was a military front based on taking state power, right? This dirty word, to take state power, that was based on taking state power in the frontline states. This is all erased from this narrative, which to be very honest, like, it is increasingly, there's a narrative that's sold by NGOs and they're like funded by the goddamn Rockefeller Foundation, right? That sell this very sanitized version and of what's happening in Palestine as though, as though just universal boycotts are going to exert enough pressure on Israel. I mean, I've participated in the nonviolent mobilizations against Israel in Gaza. I walked away with blood on my hands. So of someone who was murdered in front of me, so I'm aware of what it looks like. And when this war started, one of the things I said, because there was this kind of narrative about the fetishization of decolonial violence. These people like Adam Schatz and other people. And I puked a little in my mouth and I said, fetishization. I said, nonviolence and violence, when you're in a weaker position, are two ways to die. Actually, there are two ways to resist and there are two ways to die, right? So the idea that the outcome is nonviolent when you engage in nonviolent resistance is ludicrous. We saw our comrades getting their heads beaten in by police in New York City 3 days ago, right? There's video circulating of cops punching young people in the head in the middle of the street when they were engaging in a nonviolent protest, right? So all resistance to violent power elicits a violent reaction on the part of the powerful, because this is the language that they speak, right? So much of this is forgotten in the entire Western discourse about nonviolence, that people are going to be destroyed physically and otherwise, no matter what form of resistance they take. I mean, there's a generation of amputees in the Gaza Strip that precedes the current generation of amputees, which of course Hassan Abu Sitta and others will say they've never done more pediatric amputations or seen them in a war zone in their entire life than before this. But even before this, during the Great March of Return, which was entirely nonviolent, they were amputating people. I mean, these people don't have a leg. It's very shocking, right? So no one is fetishizing anything, right? And this really is so important to keep in mind. Actually, the only people fetishizing anything are the people who are advocating exclusively and saying anything but a peaceful nonviolence is outside our moral universe. Those are the ones who are actually fetishizing a certain form of resistance, and they're fetishizing it and obfuscating about what's actually at stake, which is mass death, right? Your people are going to die en masse when you engage in a nonviolent resistance. And like the Great March of Return, it may not produce a very large result, right? And now people are dying at a much greater pace, it's very sure. But the Israelis are responsible for that, and Americans are responsible for that, and the French are responsible for that, and the Germans are responsible for that. Not the people who are taking the measures they deem necessary in order that they can try to have a future for themselves and their children, right? So this is super important. The other thing that you said that when you were talking about Gustavo Petro, right, is that the other thing that's so important, right, is that you saw. I actually haven't seen. I'm sure you're right about what you were saying about these reactions to it. I thankfully was spared them. I didn't see them. But I saw it a lot about Ansar Allah in Yemen, and it said that they're just acting as cynical rulers of a country or engaged in cynical statecraft, and they hate Jews. And I'm like, first of all, who put the Jewish star on a tank that fired an artillery shell at children? That was Israel that did that. That was not Palestinians who did that. That was not Arabs who did that. Israel decided to put a historical Jewish symbol on all of these forms of machinery of death that just kills children. And not only children, but also children. And so the idea that people are targeted in a certain way and then take up the religious marker of the enemy that's been imposed upon them and might use certain rhetoric does not make them anti-Semitic, right? So I think, so this idea that Ansar Allah, even though yes, their slogan is not great, I would be the first to admit it, and I'm fine to admit it. I don't agree with their slogan, right? But does Ansar Allah, did they do the Holocaust? Did Arabs do the Holocaust? Did Arabs put 5 million Jews in a gas chamber? That was capitalist, white Christian capitalist Europe, right? Ansar Allah is very clear. And first of all, there's also like socialists, communists in the governing council of Ansar Allah. It's a very complicated organization. And they say, we want to impose a new law for humanity where genocide cannot occur. And suddenly they're cast as these cynical and also possibly bigoted rulers of Yemen, right? And people who didn't know about Ansar Allah and didn't know about Yemen until 6 months ago are suddenly experts on the 10,000 perfidious alleged misdeeds of Ansar Allah. 1% of which may be true. I don't care. What if they are true? It's no question to me, right? You're looking for a state with 100% clean hands. This is the real world. This is not Captain America movie, right? So the idea that Ansar Allah, which is stopping boats of Israel until the genocide stops, is this nefarious, bigoted force, is just an astounding feat of Western propaganda, right? It's crazy. I mean, and Israel was, of course, active in North Yemen during the conflict, right? It was part of that effort to burn up Nasserism in its struggle against the reactionary forces in North Yemen, which were armed by Saudi Arabia. And Israel, everyone in Yemen knows very well, separating from their own human solidaristic discourse with the suffering Palestinian people and the resisting Palestinian people, even bracketing that, right? Everyone in Yemen, or the overwhelming majority, would identify Saudi Arabia as their primary enemy, and they know that Israel would love nothing more than to normalize, to have a full normalization of diplomatic relationships with Saudi Arabia. It's very, of course, they consider Israel their enemy. Israel is trying to break bread with the steel hand of the U.S. that killed 500,000 of their people. Of course, they see Israel as the enemy. I mean, how else could they see it? Right? And what you're saying about this infantilization, demonization, these kind of right-wing mythologies around these forces that are actually just trying to make the world big enough for everybody is a very kind of astounding thing. And it shows, and to the fact that it extends to a lot of the left liberal sphere, let's be honest, is just a feat of the success of Western propaganda, and really shows how much a lot of the liberal left in the United States is still marching to the beat of the propaganda of U.S. power, instead of saying, okay, there are these forces that are, of course, imperfect because we're in the land of people and not God and heaven, that have all their problems, and that are doing something that are putting everything at stake as they just escaped from a genocidal war against them, to try to achieve some dignity and save the lives of people they've never met. Well, that's that's something people would do well to better understand, rather than reject and demonize.